Individual piece of technology, right? You can buy.
You know, this is the video. I hope you're recording, because just doing the this chit chat is definitely
this
the
is video.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm just sort of thinking about how things have changed since the last RSA, in terms of security.
It's funny. It's funny that you mention that, because my impression is that a lot of the things that organizations were talking about 2 years ago, they're actually being able to execute. If that makes any sense, I don't see a lot of net new messaging. Right, a lot of net new technology. It's really evolutions of the things that we've already been doing.
And so the theme of RSA this year is transform. Did you know that?
No, I didn't. But I don't see anything transform. That's just my opinion.
No, the transformation is really, in some ways, or maybe it's all about how kind of taking the 2-year difference, the transform theme, and the time it takes for organizations to roll out the types of solutions that we've been talking about for 2 years.
Yeah, I think you've seen a maturation in technology in some of the solutions, specifically surrounding this whole concept of zero trust. If you go around to all the booths, half of them have something written about zero trust this or that, and I think the organizations over the past few years have actually started putting some meat on the bones and some technology behind some of the marketing terms.
Yeah.
So, for example, you go over to some of the other zero trust vendors on the other side, and they're like, yeah, we do zero trust, but they didn't have a platform, they didn't have an agent that went on the endpoint, they didn't have reporting, they didn't have any kind of telemetry or observability from third-party resources. It's kind of a promise, right? They just said, I just have zero trust, and I have a policy definition, and I have maybe I have a client solution that didn't do any compliance checks, right?
Yeah,
it just connects you, right? I can authenticate you, authorize you, and I can connect you. But I think those ecosystems have grown and those products have matured. That's kind of the difference that I'm seeing on the ground.
Yeah. Joe and I were talking, or not Joe and I, Scheffler and I were talking about, when we were talking about zero trust, I kind of brought up this notion that zero trust, almost like BYOD, was this nebulous term that people had different ideas of how to go about implementing, because it was all kind of based on opinion at that point. And now, finally, after a couple of years, maybe not so much like BYOD, there's actual some structure in place. There's some parameters around this where these kinds of things that you do actually mean zero trust. It's not something you throw on a board anymore.
Right, it's the practice. There's no one individual piece of technology, right? You can buy.
You know, this is the video. I hope you're recording, because just doing this chit chat is definitely
this
the
video.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We got you. This is the way
you can purchase a piece of technology from each one of these vendors and still not achieve the outcome of having a zero trust practice or framework for your organization, right? So it's really understanding your attack surface, if you're delivering services for consumers and your next gen kind of startup company and all of your resources in the cloud, zero trust to you means something very different from, say, GM or Tesla, in manufacturing and industrial base and delivering access to consumers and employees. It's a very different animal.
Right.
But I think one of the things that that I think the industry hasn't reckoned with yet is some of the centralization of things like identity, for example. So if you go back and look at the Okta breach, in a matter of minutes, I have 400 organizations that are breached, potentially, right?
Yeah, right.
And I think it only didn't go further because who breached them didn't understand what they were doing with the platform. But that goes, if you look at what that actually meant for all those organizations, you have a set of identities that are potentially breached that they can get access in that applications potentially, right? And do I have visibility, for each identity accessing each one of those applications? And say Okta or an IDaaS provider taking an action of disabling an account actually doesn't do anything, right? Why is that? Because each of those applications handle their own session management.
Right.
And to take it a step further, what is an application? If it's a modern application, well, that's a set of microservices that could be running in containers in different environments, right? Right. So now you've taken that problem and just the scale of it just becomes that much larger. And so what that's shown us is that if I wanted to breach identity for 400 companies in the past, I had to compromise Active Directory, for example, at each one of those companies, right? 400 companies and deal with all the different security barriers that they had.
Yeah.
Now I just went to Okta and breached them in one place, right? By breaching that specific supplier. So what that's telling me is that we need to focus on more multi-point multi-vector means of validating users, meaning that I had my IDaaS, but I needed other telemetry that didn't rely on the IDaaS to tell me that this is the person who they say they are, right? This is an actual authorized request. So, multi-point, multi-vector authenticity, meaning multi-point, meaning not just the IDaaS, but maybe at the proxy and the actual application itself. But then multi-vector, meaning that they're looking at potentially different things, some of which may overlap. For example, the IDaaS, i.e. Okta, looked at the IP address and said, "Are you coming from an anonymous proxy?" But maybe maybe the proxy that sits in front of the app looked at that as well, but also looked at your device identifier, right? That was measured independently. Maybe leveraging something like our fraud intelligence engine to say, okay, this user is actually the same user, so I don't need to perform step-up authentication, or I have additional level of assurance that this is the user that is returning to access the application. And by the way, this is a user who continues to use the application, right? Because we want to have a continuous means of validating those identities as well. So I think there's another step in what everyone here is speaking about in terms of pursuing zero trust from an access and identity perspective.
Now you said like the whole centralized identity, and in some ways, right, the third party, the in the cloud, the Oktas of the world are somewhat centralizing those identities, right. But it's still may not be controlled to some extent. But I get what you're saying, yeah.
They have supply chains as well, right?
Yeah, right. Because you still gotta bounce out to the cloud, and then bounce back, and then bounce around everywhere else to do that.
And by being federated, right? Federated identity is based upon trust, right? My consumer of that identity is trusting the source of that identity, right? Because they're not exchanging the actual username, password, or certificate, for example. They're not exchanging the MFA credential, right? So it's based upon trust. You've done the work for me. I trust that you've done that work properly, and I'm going to allow that. Now, what happens when that's a breakdown in that trust, right? Where you can't trust 100% that identity that was measured at that specific point.
Right.
So that's why we need to move to multi-point, multi-vector, authentication, authorization controls. So maybe it's the IDaaS, right, like Okta, but maybe at the proxy and/or at the application, it's your FIDO token as well. Right. So I'm measuring maybe two different teams in two different places, right, simultaneously, and taking in some additional information from, there's some great machine learning solutions on the market that can help me identify, either your returning existing users or, be able to continuously help us look at things like user behavior and do that over time. Right? There's things on the market to do that. The challenge is, of course, integrating those things in with my application ecosystem.
Yeah. And still doing all the other, checks along the way to make sure, just like that silly stuff that we used to talk about all the time. They didn't turn off their antivirus.
Right.
They haven't messed with their, local firewall. All those kinds of things just to ensure.
Basic compliance checks, right?
Yeah.
From an employee perspective, absolutely, or managed device perspective, if you will. And those APIs are out there. They're ubiquitous already, right? Where you can have an agent that looks at, hey, here's the device ID from CrowdStrike. Let me take that device ID and let me query their CrowdStrike API every minute and say if does this device remain in compliance.
Yeah. Good stuff.
Good stuff.
You've been privy. Privy is a word, right? Isn't that the word where people are kind of overhearing what we're
Yeah, this was a side conversation. This wasn't planned.
Welcome to our side conversation video.
Completely unscripted.
Corey Marshall. We had planned on interviewing him formally, but just decided to have a little chit chat.
Make something out of that.
Yeah, we'll use it.
We're making something out of. I didn't even know I was being recorded.
That's the beauty of this.
Oh, I forgot to put it in.
And that's why this video will be, well received.
Thank you. Yeah, they said you'd be back later. How you been, man?
I'm all right. How you?
Oh, man, it's good to see you.
I know.
Man, do
same with
you age at all?
I do. That's a pray.
Yeah, maybe that's about it.
You know.